coming this evening to hear a bit about the life of the great beast, Aleister Crowley. We've kind of done this talk sort of backwards. Originally, I was going to go up first and kind of lead us through the beast's life until his sunset years, as it were, and Anthony was going to take it from there. But given that Crowley was a great fan of reincarnation, and he had picked out a few choice subjects that he believed he had been in a past life, it's okay to go back now. We're going to return and go back to sort of the start of his career in life. And I have, sort of a question up there. It's not grammatically correct, but it's like Aleister Crowley, magician, monster, or god? Now, you probably know about him being a magician. Aside from perhaps Houdini, he's probably the most famous magician of the 20th century, except for fictional characters like Harry Potter or Gandalf, or someone like that. So we'll get on a bit about his magician, being a magician further on. And I should say that he's actually more of a magician than Houdini was, because he didn't do stage magic, he wasn't doing prestidigitation, and he wasn't doing illusions. He was actually trying to revive the ancient Hermetic sciences that, up until the beginning of the modern age, actually carried quite a bit of prestige. They had fallen into disfavor, rise of science, but Crowley took it upon himself to resuscitate their high standing. And this is one of the things in my book called Aleister Crowley, Magic, Rock and Roll, and the Wickedest Man in the World. In the book, I call him an impossibilist, because this is something that Crowley did. He took things that he considered, or were considered at the time, impossible, and he said he was going to do it. In many cases, he did, and in quite a few cases, it's evidence of this kind of autistic exactitude that characterized his sort of thinking processes, that he would stick to something tenaciously and actually do it, and then maybe 40 years later, he would show up or send you a postcard and say, look, I've done it. So he also knew how to hold a grudge. And that was one of the kind of most iconic, to use a stupid word we use too much these days, kind of personality traits about him. So, who was Aleister Crowley? That's a very good question, because Crowley didn't know himself in many ways. Throughout his career, he adopted many aliases. For a time, he pretended to be Russian when he was living on Chancery Lane, at a time when there was quite a Russian craze in England. Not like the one that's going on now, which is more like Russian craziness. But there was an actual sort of fashion for all things Ruski back then. And he called himself Count Zwarev. And he dressed up in sort of pre-Bolshevik kind of Russian gear and all that, and affected a Russian accent and all this kind of thing. He was also called himself Prince Chawakwan, and he exasperated his first wife's mother, his mother-in-law, because he demanded that whenever they sent any communication to her or to him or to both of them, it had to be addressed to Prince and Princess Chawakwan. So quite a few envelopes got sent back to Mrs. Kelly, Crowley's first wife, Rose Kelly, the sister of a friend of his, the painter Gerald Kelly, who actually made a name for himself in the Royal Academy. But here's some of the sort of later sort of personae and self-images of Crowley in his magical days. Here's the famous photograph of the eye in the triangle, which proves beyond a doubt that he is, of course, a member of the Illuminati. And there's his magical sort of diary next to him there, which has engraved on it a very lavish pentagram. There's a later, well, maybe, I don't know exactly, this is around 1912. This is when he was writing a book called Book 4, which is actually his best book on magic. It's much more understandable and accessible to the average reader than what he considered to be his magnum opus, Magic in Theory and Practice, which was published, I believe, in 1929 in France. Ever was. Magic in Theory and Practice, he said he was going to, this book was written for all, and the banker and the pugilist and the baker and the shop girl, but none of those people had any idea, if they even saw the book, what Crowley was talking about. But an earlier book called Book 4, around this time, is actually quite a good book. This is, again, him in his magical gear when he's making the sign of silence, which is the sort of, he's assuming the god form of the Egyptian god Harpocrates, which is, there's some controversy whether Harpocrates is sort of always pictured as kind of a baby or a child, so is he sucking his thumb, or is he the god of silence? Incidentally, if you know your cultural history, there was 3 Marx Brothers. Oh, well, actually, there were quite a few. There was 5 of them originally, but in most of the films, there's 3 of them. And the one who can't speak, what's his name? Harpo. So, did they clue into this? Did they know about this? I don't know. Was Crowley predicting the Marx Brothers? Maybe. Now, Crowley's called the Great Beast, and, 666, and he adopted this persona of this devilish antinomian rebel character early on. But if you know about his life, it makes a great deal of sense. And also, if you know about his life, his subsequent career makes a great deal of sense. He was born October 12th, 1875, to a Plymouth Brethren family. Now, the Plymouth Brethren, as my picture here says, were an apocalyptic cult that anticipated the imminent end of the world. And I'm not making that up, they actually did. Crowley's mother and father and all the relatives around him and friends, they belonged to this cult. It was founded in 1820, and they accepted the literal truth of the Bible, and they did anticipate the end of the world coming, and pretty much everybody who wasn't a Plymouth Brethren was, going to get, hard times out of that, but the Plymouth Brethren would be saved. And in many ways, their whole view of the world was not that different from some contemporary manifestations of Christian fundamentalism in the United States. I don't know if you're aware of a whole series of novels called The Left Behind. There was a rather gory film made with Nicolas Cage in it, I guess when he needed the money, or his agent told him he needed it. Sometime, I think, and I don't know exactly when it was made, early 2000s, but there were a series of apocalyptic thrillers, basically, when the rapture comes and the end of the world comes, and then all the true believers are saved, and everybody else basically, is destroyed in CGI effects and all that kind of thing. And the thing with this is that Crowley, his father, was a fairly off-rich man. He inherited a very strong-going interest in a brewery and a sort of series of alehouses that used to dot the land, not around anymore. They're kind of like, the Lyons coffee houses that came a little bit later, but there were these Crowley alehouses, and mostly in the city, but in London, but in other places as well. And there were places you could go, you can get a pint of beer, you can get like a ham and cheese sandwich or something like that. And they were a little less odious than going to a pub, and they were more affordable than going to a restaurant and something like that. So a lot of bankers, a lot of city people, secretaries, people like that, they went and had a pint and a sandwich on their lunch break, and they filled the coffers of Crowley's family. Crowley's father, Edward Crowley, Crowley was born, his name was Edward as well, and he later on adopted the name Aleister, because he at first idolized his father, then actually did a complete turnaround on him. But his father was very eminent, a very big figure in the Plymouth Brethren at the time, and he used to go around the land and proselytize for their teaching, and he wrote pamphlet and pamphlet and pamphlet about it and all that. So in many ways, Crowley himself, when he later in his career developed his own religion of thelema, which is Greek for will, he did exactly the same thing as his father. He went across the land, he proselytized for his true belief in his religion. He believed in his philosophy and his religion of thelema as fervently as his father believed in Plymouth Brethren. And they both dealt with spirits in 2 different ways. Crowley drank quite a bit. His father sold them, or at least inherited a fortune based on the selling of them. And they both dealt with a different kind of spirit as well, a holy spirit. Crowley idolized his father in his early years, but he hated his mother. He considered her a brainless bigot of the most narrow-minded kind. And we don't have much about her except, his letters to her and all that. And even though he actually hated his mother, he was a rather dutiful son because he wrote her all the time. But I think he enjoyed writing these letters because he always put in something that he knew would, tee her off and get her angry and all that kind of thing. And he had an absolute addiction to basically pissing people off, if you excuse my language. He'd go out of his way to really, if he knew how to push your buttons, he would go for them all the time. And this was one way, this is kind of something that generated a great deal of his character and his personality. But I said Crowley idolized his father at first, and he was a true believer. He until about the age of 11, when his father died, he accepted the tenets of the Plymouth Brethren, and he believed in them completely. And he would go to their meetings and go to their rallies and so on and spread the word and all that kind of thing. But then at the age, when Crowley was 11, his father died. His father died of cancer of the tongue. He was taking some sort of quack electrotherapy somewhere. It may have been in Hastings, I don't remember exactly right now. And he refused to have the operation that an eminent surgeon at the time told him he should have, and this would have saved his life. But his Plymouth brethren told him not to do it and to accept the fate and destiny that God had given him. And at the same time, why don't you try this kind of electrotherapy? This might help. And for someone who was an orator, someone who gave speeches a lot, who went across the land to spread the word, the idea of having cancer of the tongue seemed somehow meaningful. It seemed somehow ironic. But almost immediately after Crowley's father died, he went over to the dark side. He started out wanting to emulate Jesus' life. He started out wanting to be nothing but a good boy, a good person, walk the straight path and so on and so on. But as soon as his father died, he did a complete enantiodromia. If you are a reader of C.G. Jung, you might know what that means. It means a complete reversal of the previous consciously held opinions and point of view. And throughout his career, he's been accused of being a Satanist. And Crowley apologists and biographers and other people who basically want us to take him seriously, which I think he should be taken seriously. There are, put it in a crude way, there are some good things about Crowley that we should know about. But they've argued against the idea that he's a Satanist. He's not a Satanist, and so on and so on. But Crowley himself isn't any help in this question, because he himself said that after his father died, he somehow decided that he would change sides. He would keep the exact beliefs he had. He continued to believe in some imminent apocalypse, end of the world. And if you know your Crowley, you know that he actually said the world had ended in, I believe, March 21st, 1904. A little bit earlier than I think the Plymouth Brethren were prepared for, and I don't know how many of them appreciated his, updated ETA of the apocalypse. But he was doing exactly the same thing. But he went over to Satan's side. He even said, I changed sides. I didn't give up the beliefs I had, I just changed sides. Okay, so we have a young Crowley there. I'm not quite sure exactly how old he is. This is probably after the switch, after he went over to the dark side. And this is a later Crowley. This is Crowley the poet. Crowley came into his inheritance when he came of age. And sometime between him going over to the dark side and going into Satan's side and actually, getting this inheritance, this is when his mother this is when she gave him the name that the nickname that we know him most for today. He was causing so much trouble, and the main thing was basically sex. As soon as he discovered sex, he went for it all the way. And he famously said that he didn't deflower, but he seduced, or he let the housemaid seduce him on his mother's bed. And people like Israel Lagarde and others have said, all this Oedipal stuff in there. But no, it's just basically, what's the most transgressive thing you could do? What's the most transgressive thing you could do in the house is have sex with the maid on mom's bed. So I don't think Crowley in any way had any kind of Oedipal desire. Although, you know, knowing him, he probably wouldn't have passed it up if it had been offered. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was basically to break all the rules. I mean, transgression is my middle name, basically, I think you could say, when Aleister woke up to what his true mission in life was. And he talks about wanting to commit the unforgivable sin. And we're not quite sure what the unforgivable sin is, but Crowley he searched it out diligently. He did everything he possibly could to, you know, rack up what could have been the unforgivable sin. And this was something, in a way, sadly, that warped him, I think, for the rest of his life. He never jettisoned this whole idea of actually, you know, breaking the rules. He was attracted by the forbidden all the time. And the strange thing about the forbidden is that, you know, only kids like to do what's forbidden to them, because they get a big kick out of doing it. And they do it because it's forbidden. And you can keep doing that, but if you keep doing that, it sort of stunts your growth. You know, you continue to remain immature. You're constantly shaking your fists at an authority that supposedly is telling you can't enjoy yourself. But this was something Crowley never got over, and it characterizes a great deal of the rest of his life. But when he came into his inheritance, he ran with it. There's different estimates about the actual amount of money in today's, you know, value of the pound. It would have been around 40,000 pounds, I think he inherited, and I think around 1896 or 97, something like that. So I don't know exactly, you know, what the exchange rate would be today. When I was writing my book, I looked up some stuff, and it basically came close to being a millionaire. So in today's money, he would have been a millionaire when he first got, you know, the inheritance. He didn't stay a millionaire very long. Let me tell you, he started spending it as soon as he could. One of the things he spent it on was lavish self-published editions of his poetry. He considered himself a poet. Not too many others did. But he considered himself a poet. He wrote a lot of poetry. There is some actually good poetry in his poetry. When I was involved many, many years ago in a Crowley group when I was in Los Angeles 40 years ago, I actually read through all of his poetry. And that's no mean feat, let me tell you. But there's actually, you know, some very, you know, good parts in there. One of the best ones is the one that was read over his cremation in Brighton, was the hymn to Pan, which is one of the, you know, it's one of the first things that you find in Magic and Theory and Practice. It's actually a very powerful incantatory poem. He was able to write a kind of poem that, you know, was able to do what poems in the olden days, you know, were supposed to do. Would put you into a kind of trance, send you into a different kind of Dionysian sort of madness. But he only hit that rarely, very rarely. Most of his poetry, at least in my taste, is very derivative. And he doesn't seem to have read much poetry past Oscar Wilde. But he just produced different editions of his own poetry in lavish, you know, binding and things of that sort. He also did his rooms up. He was a great fan of the fin de siècle decadence at the time. People like Wilde, people like Aubrey Beardsley, people like Baudelaire, the French poet from, you know, an earlier generation, but his ideas were and his aesthetic had transferred over. So he kind of ran with it. I mean, I guess today he would have been, you know, considered like some rock and roller who, you know, got a hit record, had a lot of money, and they just went to town. And that's precisely what Crowley did. But as many people who have a lot of money, don't have any pressures on them, no responsibilities, are young, and there's actually nothing to guide them to, you know, in any direction what they want to do, Crowley toyed with quite a few ideas. He you know, he had to do something with his life. First off, he thought he would be a diplomat, and again, the Russian idea was very strong, so he thought of, you know, getting into the you know, government service and being a diplomat in Russia. After a while, though, he thought that'd be rather boring. He was very good at chess, as Anthony made clear in the talk earlier, and he thought he actually, you know, might have a career as a chess master. But on one of his travels, another thing he did quite a bit is he traveled all over the place anytime he could. He visited, or he attended a chess conference in Germany somewhere, and he got to observe some of the chess masters close up, and he thought they were all kind of rather boring kind of characters. Crowley got bored very quickly. This is one of the things about his his personality. He was bored very quickly. The French religious thinker and logician Blaise Pascal in the early 17th century said that what was wrong with people is that they're not able to sit still in a room. They need distraction all the time. Crowley wasn't able to sit still anywhere, except when he was practicing his yogic meditations and practices like that, which he did master. So at those times he could sit still. But even then he was devoting his will and his energy to sitting still. It wasn't just sitting someplace and just relaxing. He was constantly on the move, constantly doing something. And the other thing he thought he could be was a mountaineer, and I'll get onto that later on. But the idea that no matter what he did, whether he was a diplomat or a chess master or a mountaineer, or even if he was a great poet, that in time he would be forgotten. These accomplishments would be dust in the wind, as an old song from the 70s had it. And this is another thing that Crowley was determined to do. He was determined to stamp his existence on reality. He was determined that it would be noticed. He wanted to be, as the psychologist Ernst Becker said in his book Denial of Death, he wanted to be of primary significance in the universe. Basically, he wanted everything to pay attention to him and notice him, and he is there. So he was looking, what can I do? What medium can I work in that will allow me to imprint my genius, which he was convinced that he had. Not so many others were, but some were. What medium could I work in which I could imprint my genius and it would last forever? So, strange logician that he was, he decided that it would be in the realm of the spirit. It would be in the realm of the supernatural. It would be in the realm of the occult. And again, as I said earlier, he was an impossibilist. And at the time, the idea that any kind of proof or convincing evidence for the higher worlds was impossible to achieve, to obtain, Crowley said, yep, that's it, I'll do that. And so that's what led him to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. The story is that while he was climbing in the Alps, he got into a conversation with a fellow named Julian Baker about alchemy. And Baker had told him that he knew of people in London that could put him in touch with a group that really practiced magic and the occult and alchemy and things of that sort seriously. And Crowley thought about it, and what happened was that he decided he was going to ask Baker who these people were, but then he realized that Baker had left the hotel that they were in. And he ran madly through the Alps, literally trying to find where Baker was before he could lose contact with him. And he finally tracked him down in some town or some ski lodge somewhere in the Alps, and Baker agreed to meet him in London, and that he would introduce him to someone who would put him in touch with those who know. And around the same time, Crowley, in his studies of magic, he got a copy of Arthur Edward Waite's classic book of black magic and pacts. And if you know Arthur Waite, he's not the most readable character. He's not a page-turner, but he's a diligent, sincere, earnest research of all these things. And in that book, he makes mention of a book written in the late 18th century by Karl von Eckarthausen, who was a German sort of mystic, called The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary, which is actually a book about Christian mysticism. So it makes it doubly ironic that Crowley would be inspired on his career of magic and the occult and all that by a book of Christian mysticism, when he's basically, I'm a Mr. Antichrist. But this book talked about the hidden church. There was some secret church, invisible church, that was behind the scenes of everyday life and the everyday church. And if you met the right person, you could be introduced to them. And somehow the combination of this idea of the hidden church and learning about the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is up here, led Crowley to want to join it. And the two characters I have up here is one is W.B. Yeats. As you know, he was a Nobel Prize-winning poet. He was also a theosophist. He met Madame Blavatsky not too long before her death. Basically, he was kicked out of the Theosophical Society because he actually wanted to practice magic. Madame Blavatsky hated ceremonial magic. She thought it was evil practice. And so when word got around that W.B. was interested in it, basically they asked him to leave, and that's when he joined the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is probably the most famous late 19th century magical group of the time. And around this time, there was this was a magical revival going on. It started in the late 70s with Madame Blavatsky, and it carried on up until just before World War I would say. So along with this Russian craze going on in London at the time, there was also kind of an occult craze. And the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was one group that Yeats was in. There's a funny story about Crowley and Yeats. Yeats had been in the Golden Dawn for about 10 years when Crowley arrived. He was already a published poet and well known for it. And Crowley was just starting out, and he was basically publishing his own work. And he gave Yeats some of his poems, and basically asked him, what did you think? And Crowley, convinced of his genius, expected Yeats to say, "Brother poet," and slap him on the back and say, "Yes, let us go forth and conquer," and all that. But Yeats kind of hemmed and hawed and kind of made some non-committal remarks about it. And Crowley then and there knew. He knew exactly why Yeats did that. And Yeats was filled, he said, with black bilious rage, because he recognized, of course, that Crowley was a much greater poet than he would ever be. Now, you can think about that, and decide for yourself, but in 1923, when Crowley was trying to kick heroin, Yeats won the Nobel Prize for Literature. The other character over here is MacGregor Mathers, Samuel Little MacGregor Mathers, and he was like Crowley in many ways. He was a fantasist, as Crowley was. He adopted different identities. He was a strong-willed, eccentric character. He called himself the Count of Glenstray, but until about 1897, he'd never set foot in Scotland. He had sort of claimed to have sort of Scottish Highland ancestry, and he walked around in Highland dress and all that kind of thing. But Yeats actually had quite a bit of respect for Mathers. Mathers was one of these strange characters who was very eccentric, incredibly willful. And there's a story that Yeats tells in one of his autobiographies about doing these sort of magical experiments with Mathers. Mathers would give Yeats a kind of symbol. There were these things called tattwa symbols. There were different sorts of magical kind of symbols, for the sake of a better word, and which one practiced meditation and visualizing. And there were certain kinds of images and symbols and things of that sort that were associated with these different sort of tattva symbols. And Yeats put it up to his forehead, and he started immediately to visualize images and scenes, and he visualized this kind of black giant raising itself out of kind of a ruin in the sand. And Mathers said, "Yep, that's right. That's correct. That's the salamander. That's exactly what you should be seeing with that symbol." And this is something that Yeats actually came to believe, that somehow Mathers knew about this, and somehow these symbols were able to evoke from what Jung would later call the collective unconscious. Yeats called it the great buried memory. Able to evoke these things that are somehow not part of our subjective unconscious, not part of my arbitrary, personal memories, but somehow deeper inside. So Yeats was absolutely convinced. Both of them were convinced of the reality of magic, and I should say Crowley was as well. He wasn't a fake. He wasn't a fraud. He wasn't a charlatan. He tried to get away with it when he could. He was a chancer, but he actually believed in magic. And I think in many ways he did have some powers. He did have insight into these things. One wants to say, if only he used his powers for good instead of evil. But he really wasn't evil either. He was just sort of really, self-centered. He was the worst about people, in many ways. He was self-centered, completely oblivious to other people, had no empathy for, anything. He famously, when he was a kid, and this is an example of this kind of autistic exactitude that characterized a lot of his personality. He once famously tried to prove that a cat didn't have 9 lives. And he did that by killing it 9 times. I mean, he chloroformed it, he stabbed it, he smashed it, he threw it out the window. He did everything he possibly could to it. And said, well, at the end, no, it's not true. Now, of course, anybody with the slightest bit of moral intelligence would say, well, Aleister, that's just a kind of saying, but no, he had to prove it. So this was the impossibilist in him. This was like he had to take everything. He wasn't subtle. He just wasn't able to pick up subtle hints. He had to prove everything and take it to like the nth degree. So when these two guys got to work on Crowley, this is what happened. So here he is. This is after his initiation into the Golden Dawn, which happened at Mark Mason's Hall, I believe November 18th, 1898. And he took the magical name of Frater Perdurabo, I will endure to the end. And he did. Crowley was another one of these guys who just didn't give up. As I said, if you got him angry, he would wait 50 years to get it back to you, and he would say, "That, gotcha." And you would have no idea who this guy was, but he would turn up, and finally he would have a sense of like getting satisfaction. So again, there was this manic persistence in him. And one of the interesting things about Crowley's associated with the Golden Dawn was that when he came into it, basically that was the beginning of the end of it. There's a long story. Mathers and Yeats weren't getting on. Mathers lived in Paris after a while. He was supported by Annie Horniman from the Horniman Museum over in South London. He worked as a curator there for a while. Then when he got into an argument, I think with her father or something like that, he was booted out, but she continued to give him a stipend, because she was a member of the Golden Dawn as well, and she was involved in it as well. And the reason why Mathers was the guy was that he was in touch with these entities that were known as the secret chiefs. Now, if you know Madame Blavatsky, she talks about the Mahatmas in Tibet. These are these kind of elevated, highly evolved individuals who have mastered, occult powers and masters the powers of the mind and all that kind of thing, and they can communicate telepathically, they can materialize and do, they kind of, they can use the force, to put it basically. They're able to do that. And the secret chiefs were the sort of the Western esoteric version of Blavatsky's Mahatmas. Mathers claimed to be directly in touch with them. And he said he encountered them once in the Bois de Boulogne on the outskirts of Paris, and he said the experience was much like the effect of having like sort of a lightning bolt, hit something near you, and it kind of does something to the air, and then the difficulty in breathing that comes from after inhaling ether. Now, I haven't had either of those experiences, so I don't know how close he is to describing what actually happens when you get in touch with the secret chiefs. But the secret chiefs were these people who were they were the Mr. X, they were the head, the brains, let us say, behind the Golden Dawn. They operated from behind the scenes, and the whole idea of the Golden Dawn was to get new members who would go through sort of the early stages and then get into what they call the second order. Briefly put, the Golden Dawn worked in a kind of 1 to 10 system of, I guess it's kind of, the equivalent of the Boy Scouts honor badge, but in a mystical sense. You worked your way up to different degrees. You went through different sort of initiations and practices and trials and something, and you worked your way up. And this was based also on the Kabbalistic tree of life. I don't have time to go into that right now. But basically, it was like the first 5. And then there was the next order, and that was the next bit up. And if people in London passed that, they were sent over to meet Mathers. But what had happened is that Crowley worked through the different levels really quickly. He was a quick study, he was bright. I mean, he was a brilliant guy. I mean, I wouldn't say he was a genius, but he had genius. He had very often flashes of brilliance. But this bad personality trait that he had actually, just pulled the rug out from under him most of the time. So he just got everybody in the Golden Dawn really angry. Nobody liked him about it. He was getting into trouble all the time, a variety of different things. And after a period of sort of, a trial period where he had to wait until he could apply for the next level, he thought he had done that, and he went to Yeats and company and he said, "I'm ready for the next level." And they said, "No, we refuse you. The portal is closed." He couldn't carry on. And so rightly so, he crossed the channel and met up with Yeats in Paris, and Yeats needed an ally. Not Yeats, Mathers in Paris, and Mathers needed an ally. So he initiated Crowley into the next level, and then he sent him back as his emissary. And then when Crowley turned up at their temple in Hammersmith on Blythe Road, they refused him entry. And then what happened after that is what's known as the Battle of Blythe Road, which is this kind of really farcical kind of thing where Crowley shows up with a couple of strong-armed guys dressed in Highland gear with a mask and a dagger, and he's there and he's going to take over all the kind of stuff, and they fight him off and all this kind of thing. Finally, it goes to the solicitors and all that, and in the end, the temple is closed down, and that's kind of the end of the Golden Dawn at that point. So Crowley had this disruptive effect on many things around him. So what does he do after that? He decides to spend a good deal of his inheritance by traveling around the world and climbing lots of mountains. He goes to Mexico, and so there's two famous attempts he made in the Himalayas. One was Chogori, which is K2, which is the second tallest. It's kind of like the Rolling Stones of the Himalayas. That he didn't get that far with that, but it was more or less an all right kind of attempt. He wasn't the leader at that time. Oscar Eisenstein was. Then a couple years later, he wanted to try Himalayas again, and he attempted Kanchenjunga, which is the third tallest mountain in the Himalayas, but it's one of the most dangerous ones. It's not protected. It's kind of out in the open. And so it's subjected to lots of winds, there's lots of avalanches, and actually no one, I don't think either of those, Chogori or Kanchenjunga, was actually successfully climbed to the summit until the 50s. You have to remember, Crowley is doing this in 1905, so they didn't have any of the gear that anybody has today. Oxygen tanks, none of that kind of stuff. They had the minimal kind of gear. But he was the leader of this exhibition, and sad to say, it ruined his career as a mountaineer. Because basically what happened is that the other members of the party mutinied, from his point of view, rebelled against him because they were upset and sick of the way he was treating the coolies. Excuse me, that's probably not a politically correct word anymore, but that's the first one that came to mind. He was badly treating all of the Sherpas, basically. All the people carrying the packs, he would whip them and all this kind of thing, and he always felt like you have to make them know that the white man is, in control here and all this kind of stuff. But basically, he had a sadistic streak, and he enjoyed inflicting pain on people. And after a while, the other members of the party just got sick of this, and they said, "That's it, we're not doing this anymore." And they decided to, go to give up and go down the mountain. And Crowley had said, "Well, look, I'm telling you, you do what you want to do, but if you go down the mountain now, whatever, I'm telling you, you're running into trouble." And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Crowley was in his tent, he heard these cries for help, and he basically said, "Serves him right." Now, no matter what you think people are doing, no matter what mistake they're doing, if you sort of know in advance that they're going to go down this way and they're going to get into trouble, the idea that later on you could somehow disingenuously say, like, "Well, I didn't know what was going on. I just heard these voices. It could have been anything," which is basically what he said. So instead of being the Superman, which he said he was most of the time, and running out of the tent as soon as he heard, cries for help and saving everyone, he let 3 people die, basically. Or not so much he let 3 people die, he didn't do anything to help. You can say it wasn't his fault. He told them not to do it, but he didn't exhibit himself in any particularly good light, and basically not coming to the aid of these people. And not only that, the next morning, he scurried down the mountain as quickly as he could. He wrote several articles, criticizing the whole affair. Story goes, he extracted all the funds that were left from the expedition from the bank, and basically hightailed it, back home. So someone who actually was a good mountaineer, if eccentric, it was this kind of attitude he had that ruined it for him. I'm not quite sure how much time I have. But the summit, let's say, or the kind of the destiny, or Crowley's road to Damascus, as it were, happened in Cairo in 1904. I'm sort of jumping around here a great deal. He had by this time married his first wife, and they were on honeymoon. And what had happened is that Rose Kelly started to act in a very strange way, and she started to say all these strange things about the Egyptian god Horus, and a variety of other kind of strange things about Egyptian mythology and religion that she shouldn't have known. She had no interest in this kind of stuff. And while they were visiting a museum in Cairo, she saw this image that's in the middle here. It's the stele, which is of Horus, and you have the Egyptian god Nuit, the god of the sky, the night sky, overarching and all that. And she somehow zeroed in on this without, there was no reason why she should have known anything about this whatsoever. And basically the message is that they want to get in touch with you. It's about the child. Horus wants to get in touch with you. And Crowley thought, as he usually did, that she was just off her nut. He didn't grant women too much intelligence or anything like that whatsoever. I didn't grant too many men that much intelligence either, so I don't think he was particularly just, getting on women. But what had happened is that, cut a long story short, over 3 nights, 3 days in Cairo, I think it's the 8th, 9th, and 10th of April, Rose channeled and discarnate intelligence from another dimension named Ivas, or I was, I don't know, I was, all kind of phonetic stuff in there. And it was from Iwas that Crowley received what is known as the Book of the Law. Now, I don't know if this is a picture of Iwas, I couldn't find one exactly, there's some others out there. Crowley got in touch with a few discarnate entities. There was one called Amalantra, there was Abu Al-Diz, there was quite a few different ones. That was one of the tenets of his philosophy, was that our job is to get in touch with these other dimensional creatures or beings, and they're going to guide us in all this kind of thing. Or they're going to guide Crowley, and he's going to guide us. But this is the beginning of his ministry, we can say. So just as his father preached the faith of the Plymouth Brethren, Crowley at this point begins to preach the faith of Thelema. And again, this is a Greek word for will. And the one that you probably know you all know about, the phrase that comes out of this is, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." And when Crowley returned, again, I'm collapsing quite a few things here just to kind of move it along, because Crowley is someone where I sense something is always happening. There's something, I've left out 150 things that have happened between him being in Cairo and him coming here. I can just give you the bare bones of it. That's also a plug for the book, if you really want to know all the ins and outs of it. But he had a rich and interesting life, we can put it that way. And when he came back from receiving the law, he decided to start his own magical organization. So he was going to do the Golden Dawn one better. And he started something that was called the Argentum Astrum, or Argentinium, or I'm mispronouncing it here, but basically means silver star. And there are Crowley scholars who say, no, it doesn't mean that, and there's all these different possibilities of what it might mean. But that's how I understood it. And when I joined it in 1978 in Los Angeles, that's what they called it. My membership dues are way, way, way late and all that, but that was a long time ago. What Crowley started this magical organization, this magical society in London called the Silver Star. And he started to attract quite a few people and quite a few members. One of the things they did was famously, they put on a series of performances of the rites of Eleusis. They put on a performance of the ancient mystery rites. Now, how they knew the ancient mystery rites, we don't know, because they really are a mystery. That's why we still call them a mystery. We don't exactly know what they did, but we do know that they drank something at the end of it called the Quay. And many people have debated what that could have been. Some people say it was mushrooms, some people say it was peyote or hashish, whatever. It was something. It was something that revealed the mysteries at the end. At the end of these long kind of festivals and rituals, you drank this stuff and then you had an experience. So Crowley was trying to do something like that. And what he did do is he made up a concoction that had peyote in it. He was one of the early people in England, in the West, to experiment with peyote. He wasn't the first. There are some biographers who claim that he introduced peyote to the West. He didn't. Yeats had it before him. He got him again. And Havelock Ellis, you might remember him. He was a famous sexologist before Freud. He wrote a famous essay where he experimented peyote, and his room is in the temple. So Crowley wasn't the first, and he certainly didn't introduce Aldous Huxley to mescaline. This was another kind of myth that goes around, that when Crowley and Huxley were both in Berlin during the Weimar years, whooping it up and all that, they introduced Huxley to that. It's just not true. But they did put on these series of performances, and they did have this beverage that people who came to the performances drank. And there's quite a few reports. There's some journalists wrote articles about it. It turns up in a few books and memoirs and all that. So he was kind of doing the Trips festivals, and kind of like Ken Kesey's, pranksters, merry pranksters, quite a bit before. And you can see these pictures of that's Layla Waddles. She was an Australian who played violin. He loved her violin player. He didn't like her to talk during the rituals because he didn't like her Australian accent. And there's some various different pictures of Crowley and the other people dressed up in the fancy dress doing the rites of Eleusis. Now, just after World War I started, the guns of August started going off, Crowley decided that his destiny lay west. It lay in America. Now, there's a variety of reasons why he may have left. One was that there were a great many unpaid bills and debts and things of that sort following him, and he may very well wanted to get away from them. I'm told I only have 5 minutes, so I'm going to do this really quickly. So Crowley went to America. The first thing he did when he got there was he started to, well, I'm skipping out something. In 1912, Crowley discovered that all along what he was doing was sex magic. He was doing the sex, he was doing the magic, and he just put the two together, and whoa, it really worked. And this is at the same time he was approached by members of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis that Anthony mentioned earlier. And they believed that he had given away their secrets about sex magic. And Crowley said, I have no idea what you're talking about. And then Theodore Roos, who was the emissary, opened his book called The Book of Lies, and he pointed to a page, and he said, it's there. And Crowley twigged, oh, that's what it's about. And so what he did after that was, instead of doing all the ceremonial sort of magic, or not doing it as much, he developed a system of sex magic, basically using the excitement, the intensity of sex, instead of sort of the slower building excitement of ceremonial magic to project his magical will and imagination. But the first thing he did when he got to America, because he was broke, he didn't have a job, he was in his 40s, his leg was killing him, was that he started to perform a series of operations, or opera he called them, with various different prostitutes that he found in New York. And when that wasn't getting him too far, it wasn't getting him work or getting him money or anything like that, he was very happy when he bumped into a journalist that he knew from London named George Vierick, who at the time was working for people who were publishing a magazine called The Fatherland. And its subtitle was Fair Play for Germany and Austria. This was a magazine in America which was yet to enter World War I. And there were a lot of German immigrants in America. And they were basically trying to muster support for the Kaiser in New York. And Crowley had to make a buck. And so he said, I'd work for you and all that. He later said that he took the job because as he was working for British intelligence, and the idea that he was going to write propaganda that was so ludicrous and so unbelievable that, well, first off, the Fatherland would lose, a lot of its readership, and I know that was a great blow to the Kaiser. And then that actually, people just wouldn't take it seriously and all that. Now, there's a book out that claims that Crowley actually did work for British intelligence and so on and so on. There's a lot of debate about that. If you go to the National Portrait Gallery, from the man who, we'll get to it right after this, from the man who was called the wickedest man in the world and the man we want to hang, his portrait now hangs in the National Portrait Gallery as one of Britain's best and brightest. And among the things they say is mountaineer, poet, chess master, spy, and down at the bottom I think it says he was interested in the occult. Or something like that. So his kind of, his reputation has gone through quite a bit of a sea change. It's another enantiodromia here. But then Crowley was also made a name for himself in Greenwich Village as a painter. He was in the Greenwich Village kind of bohemian set, the same set that John Reed and Emma Goldman were in prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. If you know that film, Reds, Warren Beatty, where he romanticized himself as John Reed. That's sort of the milieu Crowley was moving in at that time. And I'm going to have to really cut it very close here, sadly. I can only get up to the very next slide. This is Leah Herzig. This is his most loyal, most dedicated, most committed Scarlet woman. Crowley had a string of Scarlet women. These were these mistresses that he had and used in his magical operations. And he met her in New York. They became lovers. She asked him to paint her. He did, and that's the painting, and it's called Dead Souls. I can just do 2 minutes, really quickly, 2 minutes. After leaving New York, Crowley went back to England. He wasn't having a very good time in London. This is when he started his heroin addiction. He had been taking heroin at different times for his asthma, and it was actually prescribed as medicine, along with a variety of other sorts of things, but this is when he really developed his addiction. And again, he's in his 40s by this time. What had happened was that he couldn't find anywhere to live in London, in England, and so he decided he needed better climes. And so long story short, he, Leia, and a few other people got this place in Cefalu, which is not too far from Palermo in Sicily. And it's still there. I think it's in the tourist advertisements now. Last I saw it was up for sale for about €1.5 million to buy this place. But this is where he founded his Abbey of Thelema, and it's the Abbey of Do What Thou Wilt. He clipped that title from Rabelais, who has it in Gargantua and Pantagruel. And that's a picture of Crowley. Leia's there. This is one of the rooms that was uncovered by Alfred Kinsey and Kenneth Anger. Alfred Kinsey, the sexologist, and Kenneth Anger, the avant-garde filmmaker, who went in the 50s to Cefalu and took all the whitewash that Mussolini's people had put over all these paintings that Crowley did on the wall. There were all these weird, erotic, necrophiliac, strange, kinds of paintings, sort of even weirder than the ones that Anthony showed. But this, just funny enough, that's Jane Wolfe, the rather masculine-looking woman there. She was a Hollywood actress. Her best-known role was in Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. And she found her way to the Abbey of Thelema in the 1920s, basically coming for a kind of rest cure, and she wasn't quite sure what she was going to get into. But last bit, this is where there's much more after this, but this is it's all downhill from here for Aleister. Word gets back of all the sex magic, the bestiality, the drugs, the horrible living conditions at the Abbey. There were no toilets, no one did any cleaning, people ate when they could, and things of that sort. At the same time, Crowley kept up a very, very austere and serious religious practice of the rites and rituals and so on of his philosophy of the Thelema. So at the same time, it was kind of like a real big hippie crash pad. Well, before the day, he was also, trying to carry on this kind of serious promulgation of his philosophy. I'm being told I got to hit the road, folks. So sad. What comes after this is basically he comes back to England. Things go downhill. But what happens in the 1960s? He's rediscovered. By who? Oh, come on, who was there? The most famous people in the world put him on the cover of their 1967 album. And he gets picked up by the counterculture, and he hasn't been let go since then. You can see posters of Crowley in the same places where you see posters of Marilyn Monroe or Che Guevara or something like that. And I'm surprised that Andy Warhol didn't do one of those silk screens of him and all that. He's been picked up as a kind of pop culture icon now. And there's more in it, but if you want to know that part of his story, you have to buy my book, which is 1, 2. Here it is. Thank you very much.